Hello and welcome to my talk. So today I'm going to talk about surviving an interconnected world with API governance. I am your presenter today. My name is MK. I work at Tyke. We are an API management startup that's based in UK, but we have a local office in Singapore. I'm part of the Singapore team, and what you see on the picture right now is the team of startup folks with us in Singapore, right? So we have about 6, 7 people in the picture around here. We've been around in Singapore for 7 years, right? We're based in central Singapore, around Funan area. If you are around the area anytime, please drop by for coffee. We'll be happy to host you. So today's talk is about surviving an interconnected world with API governance. I've worked with my content team quite a bit on this topic itself. And what they did ask me is to be a little bit more relevant, right? And so add a little bit of AI flavor into it, but it's still a very pertinent topic, API governance. It's been around for some time, but let's see how API governance translates to an API, an AI connected, interconnected world today. Well, it's also one thing that as I was writing the script and making the presentation, right, it's also a story of how we actually came full circle to embrace API best practices because it's not just AI and how it changes the way we work at, but how we need to embrace API best practices to be able to get the best out of AI. We'll see that in a couple of slides, but let me start with a brief history of APIs in the past couple of years. So in 2021, that's slightly before I joined Tyke, we saw the world moving to be API first, right? So a lot of legacy systems that have proprietary connectors, vendor lock-ins are very strong. What happens is a lot of organizations, right, have a shift in strategy and tactics to be able to move to APIs first, right? Modernizing their legacy applications to API first. And so 2021 was the theme of APIs being the backbone of the interconnected world. There was an API first strategy, but very soon later in 2022, they didn't just see APIs as just the connectors for connecting to other systems or having other systems connecting to themselves. They saw APIs as a new revenue stream, right? Revenue streams could be direct or indirect, right? Indirect being, APIs being like a loss leader, but then enhancing product stickiness because it's fully integrated. APIs can also form a new revenue stream, selling APIs as data, right? So there are some database APIs. Stock markets provided data streams as APIs, and then you paid on a consumptive model, right? So 2022 was when we saw a lot of emergence of APIs as new revenue stream, and that added a new layer or a new wave of API first and API design and API consumptions. And then late in 2022, near November timeframe, so I put it as 2023, is when ChatGPT was announced. All right. At that point of time, it was a really amazing tool, very coherent, very intelligent outputs around that. But at the same time, if you look at what I have on screen right now, I'm guilty of that. I'm quite sure you were guilty of that as well. Is you've been giving them brain teasers, right? How many R's are in strawberries? We've made them jump through mathematical hoops, right? Brain teasers, all the kind of stuff, right? So at that point of time, AI or LMs were seen as a really good creative writing tool, but not that intelligent because we were subject to hallucinations. It didn't have the tools that made it capable of being able, an intelligent agentic AI system for us. However, that didn't stop the growth of AI, right? In 2024, we saw the rise of a lot of competitors, in the AI space. ChatGPT had Cloud, Gemini, we had Copilot, we had a lot of AI that's coming up, AI that's coming up. And so it became an era of where AI management, right, is actually API management. in 2024, right, as well at the end of 2024, we also saw the opening of a standard, which we called Model Context Protocol, or MCP for short. So it's launched by a company named Anthropic, and their AI product is Cloud over there. But what it essentially does is standardize as a protocol of how applications provide context to LLMs, and it can wrap around with an API to perform tasks, right? And so it then becomes a very useful interface for AIs to be able to perform tasks on top of us. And that's when the term agentic AI became much more popular. What we see here is a example of how an MCP client, right? Cloud itself, our IDEs, right? Like Windsurf, Cursor AI, calling an MCP server, right? MCP servers could then trigger, local data sources, or they could then actually call web APIs to be able to trigger actions for remote services around that, right? And so it's not with the emergence of reasoning AIs and planning AIs. AIs became a lot more intelligent in its ability to plan, right? Make assumptions, find workarounds, and then eventually execute around that. And what better picture to show than something that is described in the MCP website itself? This is a picture of a MacBook with a USB-C connector, USB-C hub. You can see that the analogy is that the MCP client is the MacBook itself. MCP itself as a protocol is the hub, and the MCP servers that could either be local services, right, local file services, or remote services, right? So in this example, we have Slack, Gmail, Google Calendar, all working in harmony, right? But you can then see how the MCP client itself can reach out to these services and perform tasks for us. Over time, right? It's not a long amount of time, right? A lot of organizations then saw this as a critical tool for adoption, right? What you can then do is be a lot more declarative. And for those of you who came from the Kubernetes world, where we learned about what imperative versus declarative would be, right? Working with an AI agent is a lot more declarative, where you describe what you want in even plainer English, right? And then the AI agent goes about, gives it some thought, makes a plan, brings it back to you, and then you could refine that before it's being executed, right? So it's a lot more intelligent. So a lot of these organizations have developed their own MCP servers, right? This is just a small snapshot of what you can see in a website called mcp.so, which hosts a repository of MCP servers. But you can then see things like Postgres MCPs, AWS MCPs, where you could then describe in plain English what you want, and the agent then executes that for you. So as part of a product strategy as well, right, it then becomes very critical, where you are able to put out an MCP server, and it can then drive product adoption, product stickiness as well. So MCPs not only just became a utility and a cost center to develop, it became a strategy for driving new revenue and stickiness with your existing customers. And so the way that we see it at Tyke is that all of these robots or these agents, agentic AIs, will then be armed with tools, and they are much more capable now. We believe that it's the start of a new growth of AIs and its capabilities. Right now, it's a single AI that's working by itself with all of these tools. Who knows, in the future, it could be multiple AI agents being able to corroborate and collectively work together, right? So we are kind of excited around that, but this does mean that the usage of APIs is going to grow even more. And so with how APIs are growing, how AIs are changing things around, I think the underlying message here is that work is transforming, right? A couple of years ago, it started with automation, which is very deterministic, right? There's predefined flow, predefined error handling. which is great for tasks that work in a standard workflow. But then once ChatGPT came around with AIs are now embedded in the workflow. In 2024 itself, now we're all about agentic AIs over here, right? I've got a screenshot over here, pictures from Reddit itself, but it's a really good show of how AI and APIs, right? APIs have never gone away. APIs have been there for the longest of time in all types of workflows. But now, with the growth of AI, we are seeing a sharp adoption trend in APIs. I figured to share this one, and this is a very recent development as well. This was from Shopify's CEO Twitter post over here. Just a bit more on how work is transforming, right? It's about how work is rationalizing the approach to be AI first, right? So what he did say is that before we are going to hire more, get more headcount, we need to be able to try it with AI first, right? If they cannot, possibly there's an avenue for headcount over there, right? And so this underpins the message of probably 2025 and beyond that work is transforming. AI will be here to stay, right? And if AI is here to stay, APIs are here to stay and grow. So I've shared quite a fair bit. I hope you've kind of understood where APIs play in the role of today's agentic API usage. But overall, the use of agentic AIs drives a business outcome, right? So APIs are wrapped in MCPs. MCPs are used by MCP hosts or AI agents, and these agents drive a positive business outcome. However, right, the thing to think about is that what happens if we have poor APIs? What happens if agents are, misinterpreting or hallucinating that, right? So it's a two-way street. It could possibly go in the other way as well. If you have a poor API or if you have poor documentation, something could possibly go wrong. And this is why we need API governance, because it's simply garbage in, garbage out, right? So if you have, and I'll probably show a couple of examples there as to what could happen with that, right? And I will leave you to think about what the answers are. I think the truth is you probably would not be able to figure out what the correct answers are, and hence, if you can't figure out what the answers are or how the AI will behave with these APIs, it's a very dangerous territory to tread in. So the message for me today, if you had to take anything away at all, is that good outcomes start with governance, right? Good AI behaviors start with good API governance. There are laundry list of items around that, but in today's talk, I think I will share the 3 easiest and 3 lowest hanging fruit over here, right? Starts with API design, starts with API documentation, and good access management over here. Let's start with API design, right? I will give 2 examples, right? The first example is if you have an API that's designed like a get verb, but it's a delete user endpoint. It's very confusing, right? AIs and LLMs are basically picking up, tokens and texts to be able to interpret what the next action be or what the intent is, right? Now, if you are faced with such an API documentation, right? Get, but it's a delete user endpoint, where get is traditionally used for fetching data, right? And delete is used for removing as a function, right? So can you guess how the agent will behave, right? If it's staring at the documentation like that. The next example, all right, it's a very common one. I think one that stems quite frequently from the world of REST APIs, GraphQL APIs as well, is that we often return error messages in the body, but then with a status code of 200, which is okay, right? Now, if you're an AI agent, is it actually okay or is it actually not okay? what do we then do? Because do we accept it and pass it along, or do we then do further planning? So I hope this gives you a really good idea as to how good API design would serve to help drive clarity in the agent's behavior, planning, as well as execution, right? But for us humans, right, even if we do look at it, we may be able to guess the intent, but sometimes it could confuse us as well. So the way around this, right, with governance, not just as a practice, is that there are some tools around that. So we can use some design tools, right? My favorites are Stoplight, Postman. We at Tyke also have a tool for linting as well. So this should then help you design better APIs, which then can be consumed by your AIs more effectively. Documentation, an age-old problem, I think never really truly goes away, but I think we all do understand how important that is, right? Some examples would be undocumented endpoints, poorly described functions, poorly documented or poorly structured open API documents over there, right? So in such scenarios, right, I think with the evolution of agents being smarter, right, thinking, reasoning capabilities have evolved, good agents might catch ambiguity, right? False assumptions or paradoxical statements around that, right? And it might just not execute or might ask you for further input. That's good case. In the worst case is bad agents, right? They might then execute based on assumptions or blind spots then, right? We've seen multiple cases where internally, where in some of our tests, the agents have gone ahead to remove chunks of code because they've made some assumptions based on the inputs that they have from the tools and the context that they retrieve, right? And so in either case, right, even though you may have a good agent, right, your productivity is going to be impacted, right? The trend of vibe coding where the agent does a lot of work itself autonomously, right, is reducing the amount of human input and being able to work more autonomously. But with an agent that picks up on everything, right, it could affect your productivity as well. And so things like API gateways, right, ourselves at Tyke or any open source gateways, Stoplight again, strong tool for documentation, open API specification over there, would be what we recommend for improving your API documentation itself. Lastly, access management. This is age-old security thing that most people have, and probably one that's more pertinent about asking, are agents, representing humans, or agents, client applications over there, right? And so in the world of APIs, right, when you access a remote tool, what kind of access should an agent have, right? Do you provide them with bearer tokens? Do you use OAuth? Do you use client credentials? Or, what kind of agents, what kind of access should they have? How do we even trust agents, right? Can agents use any tools as well, right? These are the questions that we have, access management. And I think a very simple one is with an agent that is supposed to act on behalf of a human, right? If it encounters an error, should they then be able to keep running API calls or keep using the tools that they do? Because in the worst case, right, we might then run into a DDoS scenario over here. So what we do have and what we might recommend over here is stick with the basics, right? So from an access management perspective, stick with the protocols that we have, OAuth, OpenID Connect over there. Trusting agents as well. There is something which we call dynamic client registration. So if a client that's a client agent or agent client is registered with your identity provider, that's a trusted agent as well, right? It can then go through the whole OAuth dance or OIDC dance to get a access token down the road. The one thing about OAuth and OIDC is then you can then restrict agents based on scopes, right? API gateways like type can then restrict permissions based on what the agent retrieves as a scope from the identity provider. Lastly, it's a really basic concept. You can then implement rate limits or quotas around there so that your agent doesn't DDoS, your tools or your upstream services. If it's your tools, you might be able to accept a higher usage of the tool. But if you're using an external tool like Slack or ServiceNow, you might run into rate limit problems around it. And it's best then be proactive about capturing these agents' behaviors and rate limit them accordingly. So in short, it's been a long talk. I think AI is going to drive the consumption of APIs via its tools. It's going to be a very strong driver of more APIs and a more interconnected world, right? The way to think about this is that APIs feeds to MCPs, which feeds to agents, and drives business outcomes. Good APIs are more important than ever, right, for positive outcomes. Bad APIs would then lead to disastrous outcomes. And the way that you get good APIs is through implementing or instantiating API governance. That's the end of my talk. Thank you for listening, and I will see you around.